How many of you have seen your estrogen level go up at any point in the past 10 years? Those of you who are tracking it. Okay, good, good. So we'll talk about what to do when that happens. How many of you realize that estrogen is maybe the most important hormone for a woman? Yeah, a few people. Okay, good. So I want to talk today about a pattern that I see in my practice. I feel like so many of us understand detox. We kind of know the basics of what to do with detox. And we have a lot of fun and maybe spend a little too much time in the retox period. And so I want to talk today about some of the hacks that help you with detoxification, help you with augmenting it, and maybe remove some of the obstacles to detoxification, which really helps you with getting rid of the bad estrogens. So we'll talk about that today, and I also want to talk about some of the reasons why we have so much estrogen pollution. I feel like many of us are living in this estrogen swamp. And some of us are getting symptoms as a result of that. So for the guys, that can be man boobs, it can be estrogenic deposits, like on your buttocks and on your hips. It can also be prostate cancer or other benign prostate symptoms. It's a little harder to pee than it used to be. And then for the women, what are some symptoms of estrogen dominance? Throw them out to me. Acne. Polycystic ovary disease, that's a little bit more complicated. We've got some excess androgens as well as some estrogen dominance, but you're right, there's a fundamental problem with the progesterone to estradiol ratio. I agree with that. Say it again? Pass my shotgun, yes, very good. So PMS, very common, tends to get a little worse for the ladies of a certain age, like 35 to 45 plus. Moodiness, not just PMS, but depression that's difficult to treat. Difficulty with weight loss resistance is another very common one. Cysts. I see this more in women than I see in men, but having cysts in your breasts, having painful breasts before your period comes, having cysts on your ovaries, having cysts in your endometrium, your uterus. So these are some of the common symptoms of estrogen dominance. And another one that I think is important is to realize that many of the xenobiotics that we get exposed to, so endocrine disruptors, many of them are also, they're xenoestrogens, so they interact with the estrogen receptor. And they also can act as obesogens. Some of them encourage aromatase, so that you're making too much estrogen. So we want to talk about what to do about this. Some of the other things that I think are important, maybe related to xenobiotics, include the overtaxed liver. So the overtaxed liver is an interesting one, and we're at this point where we have a total game changer when it comes to our understanding of liver function. It used to be when I went through medical school that if you had an ALT, which is one of the measures of liver enzymes, liver function tests, it used to be that if you had a level of ALT that was 30, 40, that was fine, not a problem. Now we understand that any woman who has an ALT that is 20 or higher has non-alcoholic fatty liver until proven otherwise. That's huge. Basically, your liver is filling with fat, and that slows down the liver even more. In men, that threshold is 30. So an ALT of 30 or greater is considered non-alcoholic fatty liver until proven otherwise. Probiotics help. Reducing exposure to endocrine disruptors helps. But one of the things that happens is that this has become a really common finding here in the United States. There was just a study looking at people in Texas where they looked for non-alcoholic fatty liver, and they found that 50% of the sample that they looked at had non-alcoholic fatty liver. That is crazy high. They have a really high rate of organic solvent exposure and also obesity in Texas. Overall, if you look at US women, it's probably about 30% of us have non-alcoholic fatty liver. And estrogen dominance goes along with that. Another issue is the overtaxed stress system. I'm not going to talk a ton about that today. This issue of insulin resistance and obesity, insulin resistance activates aromatase, turns you into what I fondly call an aromatizing bitch. And I'll show you some examples in a moment. Zinc deficiency is another really common reason for estrogen dominance, as well as alcohol and certain prescriptions, such as statins. So this photo was during my book launch last year. And I'm showing it because I was an aromatizing bitch about a year ago. And part of what's going on here, I was in New York. I had a book launch party. And in the months leading up to my book launch, I started drinking a little bit more. There was just something about a glass of wine or two with my husband every night that just hit the spot, helped me with my transition. But my liver couldn't keep up. And one of the things that happens is that I wasn't making as much progesterone in my body to balance out estrogen. We're going to talk about rock star ratios today. And in the female body, you want to have this ratio of progesterone to estradiol that's ideally around 250 to 350. I was stressed. I wasn't sleeping as much. That raises cortisol. High cortisol then lowers your progesterone levels. If you're drinking on top of it, you're raising your estradiol level and raising cortisol even more. And you become this setup for estrogen dominance. So I found myself estrogen dominant a little more than a year ago, and I had to turn the ship around. So I got very interested in some of the new data that's coming out about how you can affect your microbiome, because that is a really crucial player when it comes to modulating your estrogen levels, whether you're male or female. Another way of thinking about our exposures is this term called the exposome. And I think it's really helpful to think about the exposome in terms of biohacking, what's proven to move the needle in terms of reducing body burden, because a lot of the estrogen dominance that I see in my practice is from endocrine disruptors, external exposures. So thinking about the exposome, I think, is a very helpful strategy. And I feel like it used to be that detox was a luxury. When I went through my medical training, it was quite conventional. And there were moments in my medical training where I felt really toxic, just stressed out and not eating good food. And I was in Boston, I would periodically go to a place called Kripalu. Have any of you heard of Kripalu or been there? It's a pretty great place. And Kripalu was where I would go to detoxify. I didn't think about detoxification in my everyday life. I just thought about it as this periodic reset button that I would push. And what I believe now is that 100% of us actually need to be detoxing and thinking about this as part of our daily lives. And fortunately, there's some quick, fast strategies for how to do this that are quite well proven. There was an article in Mother Jones recently that I really enjoyed. And they had a thesis that I really agree with. The thesis is that big chem is the big tobacco of the 21st century. By that, what I mean is we have this bias in place when it comes to the chemical industry, where we assume that chemicals are innocent until proven guilty. And there's a fundamental problem with that. So when you get exposed to BPA, we understand when you get exposed to bisphenol A what it does. So it's linked to almost every chronic disease that you can imagine. And we know that BPA interacts with the androgen receptor, it interacts with the estrogen receptor, and also with the thyroid receptor. As we started to learn more about the role of BPA and how it affects our bodies, we started to see the rise of the BPA-free plastics, right? And I totally jumped on that bandwagon. That's what I got for my kids, the plastic that I got for my kids. I got my BPA-free water container. And then it turns out that the BPA-free is just as toxic, if not more toxic, than the BPA. So we need to flip that mindset that chemicals that we're exposed to are innocent until proven guilty, and have the precautionary principle, where we assume guilty until proven innocent. Another important piece here is I feel like when it comes to biohacking, I love biohacking. I'm a bioengineer, and I just feel like I was made to biohack. And yet, I feel like there are these areas of vulnerability that you want to keep revisiting when it comes to toxic exposures and also estrogen dominance. So in this particular photo, this woman has lipstick that's a little askew. One of the things we know with lipstick, and for the women in the group, I would love it if you just took your purse right now and got your lipstick out. Or maybe you have some lip gloss or a lip tint. Just take it out. And I know the lighting's not great, but I want you to just take a look at what's on your lipstick. See if there's a little summary of some of the chemicals that are in there. Cynthia Pasquale, I bet you have some organic lipstick. So here's what we know. Women in the US consume about 10 pounds of lead through their lipstick over their lifetime. 10 pounds of lead, that's a lot of lead. Most of us think of old paint, maybe we bought an old house or in an apartment with old paint, and that's how you get exposed to lead. But for women, it's lipstick. That is the #1 exposure. In fact, the average woman gets exposed to 515 synthetic chemicals every day. 515. That is gigantic. Now, for the dudes, I think it's actually lower. I haven't seen a study on how many exposures men have, but I imagine it's lower than 515. So this includes shampoos, deodorants, cosmetics, skincare, household cleaners. And I feel like even when you have a lot of awareness around this and you know what to do to reduce exposure, life gets in the way. So this morning, I was working out with a friend of mine, and I got pretty sweaty. You guys might imagine who that was. She's talking later. And I realized that I forgot my shampoo. I forgot my organic gluten-free shampoo. So I used the shampoo at the hotel, which I'm sure, just judging by the lather that I had in my hair, that it had sodium lauryl sulfate in it, which is a very common xenoestrogen. It's what gives you that lather. I also ran out of my filtered water. So I was using some of the water from the public source. And I know I was exposing myself. And that happens every time I travel. There's these interesting studies looking at people who travel and exposure to flame retardants. That's one of the really common exposures when you're traveling. Another place that's really common with flame retardants, which disrupts the thyroid, is your living room furniture. That's one of the worst exposures. So I measured a couple of weeks ago. I know you can't see this slide very well, but hopefully you can see the long black lines that are right in the middle. And I'll just read this for you. these represent a toxic level of lead and mercury. And even though I'm super careful about exposure and I've gone through chelation with my mercury issues in the past, I happen to have a fondness for sashimi, and I don't detox mercury very well. So even with this care that I take, I found that my level of mercury is high again, as is lead. Any ideas why that is? I'll give you a hint. I'm 47 years young. So it's perimenopause. That's my hypothesis. So I'm 47. My eggs are not as ripe as they used to be. And in perimenopause, what happens is you have heavy metals that are deposited in your bones. I kind of think of your bones as being this trust fund. And you make these deposits. And then after a certain age, usually 35, you begin to withdraw bone. And that turnover can start to stir up heavy metals that you have stored in your bones. So sometimes you're not, I'm not eating any more sashimi. If anything, I'm eating less. I don't have any amalgams in my mouth. The only thing that's changed is that I'm in perimenopause. And I think that's why I've got this toxic level. So it's just, I use this as an example to be thinking, don't say to yourself, yeah, I got this. Like, we want to be constantly testing ourselves, especially when it comes to the exposome. So let's talk a little bit more about the exposome. We believe that about 90% of chronic disease is related to the exposome. And I just want to say a little bit about it because it's not just the external exposures that you have. I want you to think in a really broad, integrated way about your body, your exposome. Did you use sodium lauryl sulfate anytime in the last few days? So first, when it comes to the external environment, there's stress, lifestyle, infection, drugs, lots of different ways that we get exposed. Pollution, there was just a study published earlier this year showing that women who live in urban areas who have higher particulate matter from pollution have babies with a greater risk of autism. So the data is getting more and more refined in terms of the risk of our exposome. But another thing to think about is the way that our biology sometimes goes awry. So we have these external exposures, we've got some control that we can apply in terms of reducing the exposome, but there's also this internal process, the biochemistry of detoxification, et cetera. And that includes what happens with xenobiotics when they come into your body. Quick example. When you get exposed to endocrine disruptors, they get stored where? They get stored in your fat. I just was talking about heavy metals in your bones, but endocrine disruptors don't really get stored there. They mostly get stored in your fat. And I feel like this is one of those chapters from the book Life is Unfair. When you lose weight, somewhere around 10 to 15 pounds, the endocrine disruptors that are stored in your fat get released. And I feel like this is such a terrible irony. For someone who's losing weight and they're making progress, they've lost 15 pounds, all of a sudden their blood level of endocrine disruptors goes from their baseline to an even higher level and can act as an obesogen for them. And that's why so many people hit a weight loss plateau when they're losing weight. There's also biomarkers that you can track. I mentioned heavy metals. You can also look at metabolic products. You can look at, for instance, estrogen. Estrogen is this whole family of different estrogen hormones, estradiol, estriol, 4-hydroxy, 4-methoxy. And you can track these. You can look at how you're metabolizing them, which I think is really important. Of course, we all have genes that make us metabolize better or lesser compared to another person, but we want to be on this. And I feel like that is an important part of your estrogen cure. There's also immune modulators and hormone-like substances. So many of you know about endocrine disruptors. I just want to say a couple of things about it. Candace Pert talks about molecular sex, and I think this is a really important concept for us all to be on the same page about. So in this graphic, you can see orange hormones that come down and bind with a receptor on a cell. And I think about this as a lock and key relationship, right? Where you have a receptor, you have a hormone, the hormone and the receptor have sex. Some of us are having really good sex, and some of us not so much. One of the things that happens is that you can have an endocrine disruptor or a chemical that looks a lot like a natural hormone, shaped sort of similar in terms of what happens, what goes into the receptor, but it can bind the receptor and not let go. So the idea with molecular sex is that a hormone binds the receptor, lets go, binds the receptor, lets go. That's ideal. But many of these endocrine disruptors bind to the receptor and don't let go. So as you might imagine, these receptors are quite promiscuous. And we want to prepare ourselves and also mount a defense. Another issue that I think makes this area of medicine more challenging, especially when it comes to estrogen and how you manage it, is that very few physicians go through nutrition training. So this is a slide I got from Mark Hyman, where a survey was done in 2010. They found that 1 in 3 medical schools actually had the required number of nutrition hours that they're supposed to have. And I remember when I went through Harvard Medical School, at the time, Andy Weil, he even had the white beard back then, Andrew Weil, he would say, when I went to Harvard Medical School, he's a little over 70 now, they had 30 minutes of nutrition training. And when I went through, they had about the same. So it hadn't changed much. And I think it raises this point that we have such a need for nutritional endocrinology, for removing the root cause of imbalance and adding factors that create balance, especially with the way that you eat and supplement. So let's get into some hacks for estrogen. I want to give you a few practical tips now that I've talked about the doom and gloom and you all feel vaguely unwell. And maybe you want to check your mercury and your lead level and stop using the toxic lipstick. So the first hack is food first. And I know you've heard this before, but I just want to highlight some of the newer data that I think is really interesting here. I teach a detox twice a year, and I show people how to eat a pound of vegetables a day, because I think that's incredibly important. Mostly it's a fiber effect, the way the fiber interacts with the estrobolome. And if you want extra credit, I think 2 pounds of vegetables a day is the best way to go. Another valuable strategy is activated charcoal. Activated charcoal, I'll show you the data on that in just a moment. So the estrobolome is so fascinating to me. I can totally geek out on it. I can't get enough of the estrobolome. And the idea with the estrobolome is that it's the microbes and also their DNA. I like this idea. There's a professor at Stanford who talks about how our idea of self has really changed. Like, rather than thinking of ourselves as a human or a mammal, really we are this set of microbes. And we're just the vessel for this set of microbes. They outnumber us 10 to 1. Their DNA outnumbers us about 150 to 300 to 1. And your estrobolome and how it's doing with your estrogen level, your beta-glucuronidase activity, which is an enzyme that can make you hang on to estrogen and recycle it in your body so you keep stimulating the estrogen receptor. that modulates your risk of many of these cancers that we've been talking about. So breast cancer, ovarian cancer, endometrial cancer in women, prostate cancer in men. I like to talk about the data even when it's not convenient. And I would say the Pringles study is not very convenient. So I just want to go through that for a moment. Has anyone heard of the Pringles study? Did you hear about this when it came out? So it's really interesting. It's a study that came out of Anniston, Alabama, where they used to have a PCB factory. This was a randomized trial, so this is one of the best types of evidence that we can have. And they did a one-year study where they took 28 residents, and half the group got 12 Pringles a day, regular Pringles. The other half got 23 Pringles per day, 24 Pringles per day that were made with Olestra. And they found that the people who were obese and overweight had a harder time excreting their PCBs. The thinner subjects that they had reduced their body burden in 1 year of PCBs by 26%. That's kind of stunning. Like, we don't have a lot of data showing that supplements do this to the degree that Pringles does. So I think this is really interesting new data to be thinking about. It just makes me want to cry that Pringles is the most effective thing that we have. So we need to come up with some better strategies. So food first, I wanted to say with activated charcoal, I just immersed myself in the literature, and here's what I found. There are 64 studies of activated charcoal. Most of them are pretty lousy in quality. There's 2 that are high quality. And these 2 studies show that they're very effective at removing organophosphorus pesticides and also cardiac glycosides. So I agree with one of the comments that Dave has about using activated charcoal when you're at a restaurant and you don't know about the food quality, or if you're trying to reduce your risk or your exposure to alcohol. Second hack is to reboot your gut. So a couple of things about this. You may have heard of the 5R protocol, which is a basic protocol for the gut. Very quickly, this is to remove food sensitivities, allergens, pathogens, like yeast, which is happening next door. Replace fiber and missing nutrients. Like maybe you're missing zinc, and you need to fill that gap so that you can reverse your estrogen dominance. Replace enzymes like betaine HCl to reduce dysbiosis. Dysbiosis, by the way, is one of the key contributors to estrogen dominance because it upregulates beta-glucuronidase in the gut. And I think of beta-glucuronidase as being, if you have higher levels, you're basically going to have higher levels of estrogen in your body, more estrogen pollution. Repopulate, restore good bacteria, repair the gut lining, and then rebalance your stress response and your lifestyle. I'm going to skip ahead to chronobiology. This is hack number 3, and it's a very interesting hack. There's some new data showing that women with breast cancer tend to have a very flat cortisol curve. And I feel like this is very important for biohackers to be tracking the mediators of chronobiology. What time do you go to sleep? Are you consistent every night? When you reduce the amount of sleep that you have at night, even by 3 to 4 hours, that changes your transcriptome, the transcripts that you make related to your inner clock. So you want to reset your chronobiology. Here's an example of a flat cortisol curve. There was a study called the Whitehall study that found people who have flat cortisol curves, like this one, where it's flat across the line instead of a downhill ski slope shown in blue. People with a flat cortisol curve, this is a risk factor that is higher than smoking when it comes to your risk of cardiovascular disease. So it's something to really take seriously. And I think it should be an important part of a biohacker's armamentarium. So let's do some rockstar ratios, and then we will be finished. For men, it's hard to get clinicians to really commit in the literature and also in terms of their practice to ratios. Like, what should you go for if you're a guy and you're trying to figure out the right testosterone to estradiol ratio? From the literature, I think 15 to 30 is really an ideal range. I think when you get above 30, there starts to be more problems with just too much testosterone and not a lot of brain power that can be applied outside of thoughts of sex. For women, that ratio I mentioned earlier, progesterone to estradiol, you want 250 to 350. So you want 300 times more progesterone molecules in your blood compared to estradiol. That's all comers. I think it's more important in premenopausal women. So that is the end of the talk. Thank you so much for your attention. I think we're out of time, so I can't, yeah. Okay, thanks everybody.
Thank you.